Hi. In this presentation, we're going to be talking more specifically about France during World War II. In the last presentation, I spoke about World War II in more general terms, how Europe arrived at World War II and what that meant, and um, the techniques used to kind of present the Jewish population as nefarious. So, in this presentation, we're going to focus more on just France and specifically more on one um, person who stands out during World War II in France, which is Charles de Gaulle. So, let's kind of remember what happened. So, France had set up, Europe had set up this line called the Maginot Line, which they kind of set up as a defense against Germany, um, kind of bordering, the area between France, Belgium, and Germany, and reinforced it so that they would prevent another type of attack, such as the one that they had during World War One. So, of course, World War II utilized different tactics than World War One, and one of the tactics utilized was the Blitzkrieg, which, if you remember, was the use of planes and just massive bombings, and then coming in by land with tanks and finishing the job off. So at this point, the French had expected, this is 1940, and so Hitler has started to show signs of wanting to start a war with several nations, and with his ultimate goal of reuniting the Germanic population, which we could also call the Aryan population. Um, and so his plans are to invade, and France isn't has this idea of how Germany is gonna invade. So they're already aware of the fact that Hitler is planning on invading, but they have this notion that Hitler is gonna invade this one way, and Hitler went a different way, and Hitler went through a way that was more easterly than they had expected. They expected a more westerly invasion, and so they had reinforced the westerly defenses, but not so much the eastern defenses. So Hitler uh, invaded France, Belgium, the Netherlands fairly quickly. It didn't take that long for him to just kind of march through, and by the end of June 1940, France has been invaded by Hitler. So this is the situation now. And the people who were in charge of France at the time um, thought that they would perhaps be able to kind of come to an agreement or do this diplomatically. And there was one person who um, saw that this wasn't exactly a person that you might want to reason with, and was more apt to fighting against the Germans versus talking with the Germans. And this person was Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle had been a notable military man during World War One, and subsequently he wrote several books, one of which was about creating a working military class, which didn't get a great reception in France or wasn't extremely popular, but was noticed by the Germans, who kind of used that model as, the working military to help them in World War II. So, anyways, Charles de Gaulle disagreed with his superiors, and he was high up in the government, um, and he felt that France should fight, and his superiors disagreed and felt that they should seek diplomatic means of resolution. So, as I believe we talked about last time, France ended up capitulating to the Germans and created what was called the Vichy government. So they moved the seat of power from Paris to Vichy, which is a spa town. And the head of the government was called Maréchal Pétain. And he was not necessarily a collaborator, but he wasn't either looking for trouble with the Germans. So it was more an issue of being able to kind of talk to the Germans and deal with the Germans and that kind of thing. But he did have a man with him, Darnaud, who was much more on the German side of things. He was much more of a Darnaud was perhaps more flexible with his patriotism. And we'll get back to that later. But so Charles de Gaulle disagreed with his superiors, and he could not really abide by the Vichy government, which was not fighting the Germans. Let's put it that way. It wasn't necessarily collaborating with the Germans, but it also wasn't fighting the Germans. So what Charles de Gaulle did is he fled to England. Okay, so here you have de Gaulle. And it should be noted that Charles de Gaulle is one of the most famous French people. If you go to Paris, there are two airports in Paris, and one is Orly, and the other one is has the abbreviation CDG, and that stands for Charles de Gaulle. So the French International Airport is named after this man. So that should tell you a little bit about how the French feel about de Gaulle. So here you have Pétain, who was a World War I hero, but was also quite old when he took over the Vichy government, which was, he was around his 80s. And then you have Darnaud, who had been part of some very right-winged organizations that kind of mimicked the Nazis. So if you can think of Pétain as being not necessarily a collaborator, but a kind of somebody who wants to seek a solution, whether that means diplomatic ties with the Germans or not. But Darnaud was much more of a nefarious character, and he did try to join the resistance, but he basically wasn't accepted in the resistance, and then he ended up ultimately joining the Nazis and was, part of the SS. So he was somewhat of a double agent, if you will. So, okay. So at this point in time, France is occupied by the Germans and everything that goes along with that. And de Gaulle has fled to England because he cannot abide by the way things are being done in France. And in England, he finds a friend. Now, not necessarily someone that he was actually friendly with, but somebody who was willing to take him under his wing. And that person is Winston Churchill. And what Winston Churchill does is he sees something in de Gaulle and he thinks, this man has something to say. And he decides to give de Gaulle the opportunity to use his airwaves and speak to the French people from the BBC. So at this point, radio is the number one means of hearing what other people have to say. There's no widespread television. Radio is it. So Winston Churchill agrees to put de Gaulle on the radio, and de Gaulle gives a very famous speech, which is one of the pictures there. And basically, what de Gaulle says is that France must resist. That it's not he's gone, but at the same time, that doesn't mean the French should not resist the occupation of the Germans. And from this, we have this movement called the Resistance. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But Winston Churchill saw something in Charles de Gaulle and felt that it was important enough that he wanted to really buttress Charles de Gaulle and give him this opportunity to kind of heighten himself. Charles de Gaulle was not necessarily a very extroverted man. He was a very calculated man. Whenever he gave a speech, he rehearsed the speech. He rehearsed his movements. His language was impeccable, but he was kind of calculated and had an issue with, let's say, just being out in public and showing his face. So Winston Churchill decides, what the best thing to do is that we're gonna make you famous. We're gonna put you out there, and we're gonna let the world see what you have to say and what kind of person you are. So he gives him his airways. He arranges for a photo shoot and a spread, and he has this photographer come over to de Gaulle's house. And it was a very awkward photo shoot. You can see it's very unnatural. He's there with his wife at home, and he didn't enjoy the experience at all. This wasn't de Gaulle's thing. So you can see him there artificially reading a newspaper, artificially talking to his wife, looking at some plants. It was a very odd photo shoot. But at the same time, it did its job. And it should also be said that de Gaulle, his wife was absolutely essential to him, was really a big partner. She never wanted to be in the spotlight whatsoever, and she kind of recoiled from it. So really, there were no interviews with her or anything like that, but she was definitely a big support for him and always present. And de Gaulle will be somebody that we talk about later on as well, because he comes back. So anyways, he had this awkward photo shoot, and he had the amazing speech on the radio that told the French to resist the Germans by any means possible. And that speech kind of bolstered the movement. And so the French resistance became strong. So I have this poster here, and these people were all part of the resistance. Not all of them were French, and that's kind of the point that I wanted to make, was that the resistance wasn't something about a nation resisting, but it was a movement resisting the German occupation and the atrocities that the Germans were committing at the time. And so those people that you see on the poster, it says liberators, and then it says liberation by the army of crime. And the people that you see in the poster were ultimately executed by the Germans. But they came from different nations, came from different backgrounds, and what that shows you is that at the time there was no such thing as Facebook or the internet or anything like that. So to organize a nation, to organize a movement across nations, took a great deal of coordination, really, and the resistance was an important part of World War II that often is overlooked, but actually contributed quite a lot. So there you have also the card of somebody who was in the resistance, and this is a 12-year-old boy. So you never really quite knew who was in the resistance. And I've had some experience with people in the resistance because my family was in the resistance. So in the 1940s, my family had just started. Um, in the 30s, they'd started a publishing company, and in the 1940s, they used their publishing company to publish some underground newsletters. So those would circulate. And also another thing that I know that my grandfather did, which he didn't even tell my grandmother or any of their children, was that he had a secret room in the basement of their house. And this is, you have the wife, and he had 7 children. So imagine having a secret room when there's so many people around. I'm not sure how that really worked, but supposedly my grandmother did not know about it. Um, but he had a room in the basement, and um, the room served the purpose of whenever a British Air Force man um, landed, or somehow needed refuge, shelter, they could come and stay in that room. So it sheltered Royal Air Force pilots. And so everybody kind of did their part. That was the whole thing about the resistance, but you had to be able to trust the person. And so you're dealing with a situation, the context of which is um, there are people who are willing to do whatever is necessary to keep their family alive. Uh, and if that means giving you up to the Germans, they will do so. And then there are people who feel that there is a greater movement that needs to be pushed along, and they feel that they should, for the greater good, run the risk of um, sheltering people who could get them killed. So you're living in a society of fear. You're living in a society of doubt, um, where you don't know where your neighbor stands. You're not quite sure. Um, so not a lot of trust really between people. But if you do find people that you trust, you end up at these resistance meetings, or and you feel like you can trust those people. So this movement was a very important movement in Europe, and contributed a great deal to the efforts of the war, which I think in Europe they're more recognized than they are here. But the resistance really did a great deal. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to just kind of um, mention was the the black market that was going on during World War II. So, as you can imagine, resources are scarce, and food is being rationed severely. So, um, if you wanted to buy some butter, or if you wanted to buy some eggs, if you wanted to buy sugar, you would have to pay for those things with gold. So money was not worth as much as it used to be. Now you basically had to trade things in gold to get anything. So I'm not going to talk about the intricacies of war, since I kind of talked about World War II last time. And really, there's not too much to mention um, as far as that goes. But we end up at the liberation of Paris in 1944. So the Europeans were unable to fight back against the Germans, and until the British and the Americans intervened. So finally, the liberation of Paris took about 3 weeks, but in 1944 it was finally accomplished. And you can see here the pictures, and you can see that those are probably American tanks. And you can see how many people came out. And you can see Charles de Gaulle there on the bottom right kissing the flag. So once Paris was liberated, so after the storming of Normandy and the attack of the Americans and the British against the Germans, and the liberation, Charles de Gaulle felt that he could return. So he returned following that, and he was met with great acclaim, and the people loved him because he had been somewhat the supporter of the resistance movement, and he had been the one who kept telling France not to give up. So even though he was not welcomed in his own country during the war, he kind of kept up his efforts from afar, and kept encouraging the French to not give up and to keep fighting in whatever way they could, even if they were not able to go out on the battlefield and fight man to man. They were able to do it in more surreptitious ways. And I think I mentioned this movie last time too, but just because it's one of the more recent movies, and it's a fun movie to watch. But if you've seen Inglourious Basterds, you can kind of get the idea of what maybe the resistance was like, especially when you see the scene with Brad Pitt in the bar, where he ends up in a Mexican standoff. The coordination of these efforts was not a small thing. They had to use code words, and they had to figure out what was going on. But in the end, each little piece played a part in defeating the Germans and in figuring things out. So you basically here have Paris free again. So, all right. So de Gaulle. So after World War II, de Gaulle had such popularity that the population wanted him to be leader of the provisional government. So he was the leader of the provisional government from 1944 to 1946, and the Fourth Republic starts in 1946 at the end of the provisional government, and we will be revisiting Charles de Gaulle because he was elected president and ruled from 1959 to 1969. So we're going to talk a little bit about the events that occurred post World War II for France. And those are mainly going to involve France's colonial holdings, because if you recall, France was, and still is, a country that held a lot of colonies and had a lot of colonial power. So these things are going to come back and maybe not be so pleasant for France, since if you were a country colonized by France, which means that France invaded you, and then you watched France being invaded by Germany so easily, you would wonder what kind of country invaded you. So next time we'll be looking at the colonies and post-colonialism. So see you next time.